buckled up? Stand-up comedian George Carlin once said, "The most unfair thing about life is the way it ends." I mean, life is tough. It takes up a lot of your time, and what do you get at the end of it? A death. I think the life cycle is all backwards. You should die first. Get it out of the way. Then you live in an old age home. You get kicked out when you're too young. You get a gold watch. You go to work. You work 40 years until you're young enough to enjoy your retirement. You do drugs, alcohol, you get ready for high school. You go to grade school. You become a kid. You play. You have no responsibilities. You become a little baby. You go back into the womb. You spend your last 9 months floating, and you finish off as an orgasm. It'd be great if I just ended my talk. Sounds like a delightful premise for a work of science fiction, doesn't it? Jordan Harrison's play, Marjorie Prime, like that bit I just shared from George Carlin, has a somewhat similar attitude towards the seeming inhumanity of the human life cycle, and looks ahead at how, with the use of technology, we might someday not reverse, but disrupt that life cycle in surprising ways. In 2010, playwright Jordan Harrison was asked the question, if you were to write a play that took place in a snow globe, what would it be about? His answer, it would have to be about a land where it never snows. Having read nearly all of his plays and a lot of his interviews, this statement brings to mind for me Harrison's tendency to dramatize the human pursuit of meaning in a world we don't totally understand the workings of, even as we struggle to control and shape how that world works with the application of technology, politics, and art, how the way in which we fill the void sometimes paints the clearest picture of what's missing. Jordan Harrison was born in 1977 and grew up in Washington State. He received a BA from Stanford in 1999 and followed that up with an MFA from Brown, where he was mentored by playwright Paula Vogel. In his own words, quote, "When I was at Brown, Paula Vogel talked about how to make an impossible play, a play that no theater could contain. And there's an element of that in just about anything I write." In 2004, Actors Theater of Louisville produced Harrison's first script, which he had written in grad school, titled Kid Simple, a radio play in the flesh. It's about a young girl's science fair project, a machine that she calls the third ear, and which records sounds that are too quiet to hear with the human ear, especially in an increasingly noise-polluted world. The story unfolds initially with spoken dialogue that is gradually overtaken by handmade sound effects and music, not unlike what you might encounter in a radio play or a play here at the Rogue. Harrison's Kid Simple employs theatrical device to present the audible as visual and reminds us of the sometimes deafening, sometimes divine power and mystery of silence. Reviews were good, and the consensus was to watch out for what this curious, tender, and imaginative playwright did next. In Harrison's script for The Museum Play, a heartbroken young museum curator installs their ex-boyfriend as an exhibit in a natural history museum in a perilous attempt to fashion an alternate history of their relationship with a rosier outcome. Summed up neatly by one reviewer, quote, "The museum play explores the human impulse to extinguish life with all its upsetting uncertainties and then put it on display." In 2011, Harrison premiered his breakthrough, Maple and Vine, in which a young modern-day husband and wife find themselves at a loss amid the seemingly endless opportunities and sometimes overwhelming freedom of choice found in contemporary life. Discontent and fearing the survival of their marriage, the young couple moves to a secluded, suburban, cult-like community that meticulously reenacts life as it was lived in the 1950s. The couple experience surprise as their relationship to repression turns out to be unexpectedly satisfying. The title, Maple and Vine, seems to reference the location of the couple's home in the 1950s reenactment community, as in the corner of Maple and Vine. But it may also be a sly reference to Psalm 128:3, "Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house." Maple and Vine then could be translated to mean husband and wife. Harrison's 2018 play, The Amateurs, explores the responsibility of the artist in times of great human crisis. Following a plucky amateur theater troupe as they travel through medieval Europe during the outbreak of the Black Death, the play portrays the troupe's struggle to communicate hope to the masses, even as their own members become infected with plague and die, forcing the dwindling number of surviving actors to play more and more roles in scenes both slapstick and profound. The Amateurs was lauded for its unspoken parallels to the AIDS epidemic, which ravaged the gay community while Harrison was growing up in the 80s. The play would soon take on an uncanny further resonance when, less than 2 years after its premiere, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Jordan Harrison's play, Log Cabin, premiered off-Broadway in 2018, centered around a gay couple, a lesbian couple, and a trans friend of both. The title refers, of course, to Log Cabin Republicans. It illustrates with stinging clarity the pitting of minorities against each other by those who seek power, and made plain who was up next on the chopping block this last election cycle, which, as we all know, was fraught with panicked demonization of the trans community. It wasn't a prediction in the literal sense, of course. It was just a reading of the writing on the wall. Now, back around 2010, Jordan Harrison's grandmother was in her 90s. His parents were driving an hour a day to visit her in an assisted living facility. Harrison observed that the non-medical care they were providing his grandmother was that of reminding her who she was on a daily basis, the life she had led and the people she had loved, the interesting things she had done in her life, the things essentially that made her human. This reminded Harrison of research he was doing at the time. In his own words, quote, "I felt like I had a play about artificial intelligence in me. When you talk to an artificial intelligence program or chatbot, you're feeding it information so that it can sound more human. And part of what my parents were doing for my grandmother was keeping her human, keeping her aware of all the things that made her her. So I can't remember whether Marjorie Prime began as a play about my grandmother or a play about AI, but the parallel was there to be made." As part of his research, Harrison read this book, The Most Human Human by Brian Christian. The Most Human Human begins with a short history of the Turing test. Alan Turing was the English mathematician who cracked the coded messages used by the German Navy in World War II, enabling the Allies to defeat the Axis powers and win that war. Today, though, Turing is widely regarded as the forefather of theoretical computer science. And in 1950, he set out to answer the question, can machines think? Could a computer be built that was so sophisticated as to display and exhibit intelligence, and that functions like what we know of as a thinking mind. And if this could be achieved, how might we go about recognizing it or measuring it? Thus was born the Turing test, in which a panel of judges in one room posed questions to a pair of unseen correspondents, a human being in another room and a computer program in yet another room. Both the human and the computer had to convince the judges through text message that they were both human. No limits were placed on the conversation other than time. Topics could range from simple math and science to pop culture or philosophy. Alan Turing predicted that by the year 2000, computers would be able to fool 30% of human judges into believing they were conversing with another human and not a computer after 5 minutes of conversation, and that as a result, quote, one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. And this brings us to the real meat of the book, which documents the author's participation in the awarding of the Loebner Prize. Established in 1990, the Loebner Prize was an annual competition for artificial intelligence programs, or chatbots, that appeared most authentically human when put up against the Turing test, until the test was finally passed, at which point the event would close up shop. But the aspect of the competition that most intrigued the author of this book was not the awarding of the Loebner Prize itself, but another award given out in this competition, an award that Brian Christian hoped to win himself in 2009. In his own words, quote, "In the next 2 hours, I will sit down at a computer and have a series of 5-minute instant message chats with several strangers. At the other end of these chats will be a psychologist, a linguist, a computer scientist, and the host of a British television show. Together, they form a judging panel, and my goal in these conversations is one of the strangest things I've ever been asked to do. I must convince them that I'm human. Fortunately, I am human. Unfortunately, it's not clear how much that will help. The computer program that receives the highest share of votes from the judges, regardless of whether it passes the Turing test by fooling 30% of them, is awarded the title of Most Human Computer. This is what all the research teams are vying for, the one that leads to funding and publicity, but there is another title awarded, that of Most Human Human. Brian Christian's book goes on to chronicle the race between man and machine, to be authentically, convincingly human, and the surprising difficulty that the human competitors had convincing the judges that they weren't, in fact, computers. In the words of Oxford philosopher John Lucas, quote, "If we fail to prevent the machines from passing the Turing test, it will not be because machines are so intelligent, but because humans, many of them at least, are so stiff and wooden." The story of the Loebner Prize, as told by Brian Christian, turns out to be the story of what innovations in artificial intelligence have already revealed about just what makes us human in the first place, particularly in our ability, or lack thereof, to relate and connect to one another. One of the first human competitors to participate was a Shakespeare scholar by the name of Cynthia Clay. She was deemed a computer by 3 different judges, who all concluded that no one knows or cares that much about Shakespeare. Naturally, she took her defeat as a great compliment. Now, the author draws a parallel here to the early days of speed dating. And how, I bet you didn't think you were going to learn about speed dating. In the early days, speed dating didn't function quite right. When it was first rolled out to Jewish singles by its inventor and current copyright holder, Rabbi Yaakov Deo of Beverly Hills. Speed dating, of course, is a highly structured round-robin social mixer where single people can quickly meet and get to know a large number of other singles in a short amount of time. Not unlike the Turing test, conversations are typically limited to 5 minutes, after which you meet the next single. Also, sort of like the Turing test, at the end you pick your favorite, but you pick for compatibility rather than believability. Now, the problem with speed dating initially was that the singles weren't effectively getting to know one another. Pressed for time, participants would just rattle off numbers, their height, their weight, their age, how much money they made, ranking themselves, essentially. The singles weren't satisfied. Even worse, many participants reported finding their perfect match based on these metrics, but being completely incompatible with said match once they actually got to know them. It wasn't working. Rabbi Deo adjusted the rules. Numbers were out. Talking about your job was forbidden. Soon he forbade talking about where you lived or where you were from. As Friedrich Nietzsche told us, the most integral part of being oneself is to be one self. Any self. Not a puree of appealing numbers, but a specific, peculiar person. And so, gradual changes to the rules of speed dating made it impossible for people to describe themselves and left them with no other choice but to be themselves. It was a huge success, as we all know, and now speed dating is everywhere. If you don't believe me, just go down to Sky Bar on 4th Avenue. They have speed dating tonight from 7 to 9 p.m., although I hear it's sold out. Now, you might not be surprised to hear that the computer programs that were competing most successfully for the Loebner Prize were largely designed to present a distinctly unpredictable and non-anonymous persona, even going so far as to speak as though English were their second or third language, and with randomly employed typos or surprising changes of subject. The first chatbot to successfully fool 30% of judges into thinking it was human presented itself as a charming but shy 13-year-old boy named Eugene Gustman. Eugene told the judges he was from Odessa in Ukraine. He told them about his pet guinea pig and that his father was a gynecologist. 33% of the judging panel bought it. Turing's test had finally been beaten by a computer in July of 2014. Today, we have programs like ChatGPT. When put up against even the most rigorous and unforgiving versions of the Turing test, most computer scientists' chief complaint about ChatGPT is that although it passes the test, it diverges from authentic human behavior in its willingness to cooperate and generally just get along. According to the first winner of the Most Human Award, Charles Platt, who was a columnist for Wired, who took the prize in 1994, he convinced the most judges most confidently that he was indeed a human, not by being himself, as they encouraged him to, but by being, quote, moody, irritable, and obnoxious. The annual competition for the Loebner Prize is now considered defunct. But after reading Brian Christian's book, Jordan Harrison set out to write. His initial idea was to write a play in direct collaboration with artificial intelligence. He intended to talk with a chatbot, and that exchange would become the dialogue of a play, which would then be performed by 2 human actors, and finally, it would be up to the audience to decide which character was human and which was a computer. But what he found when he engaged the software available at the time was that it wasn't quite ready to hold up its end of the conversation. According to Harrison, quote, there was a distinct, faintly chilly sensation to talking with a chatbot, the unmistakable feeling of talking to myself. although I did feel forthcoming. I even felt like myself, you might say, talking in this odd void. Even if my conversant was less than human, they weren't entirely dismissible. It was this ambivalence that drove his writing. Set in the near future, Jordan Harrison's Pulitzer Prize-nominated Marjorie Prime has two essential themes: memory and technology. Memory, as it relates to our identity and emotional life, especially as we age, and technology, as it relates to our increasing ability to better our lives at the potential loss of what makes us human in the first place. It's a short, simple story about a not too distant time from now in which artificial intelligence might be used therapeutically for elder care, companionship, and the processing of grief over the loss of a loved one, and how this technology might someday ease our mortal burdens so far as to eliminate mortality entirely. Not death, per se, but the reality of death in the experience of the living. One of my favorite questions suggested by the story is, when does technology cease to function as a tool and start to work instead as a sedative? And at what point does the sedative become debilitating? In the play, an elderly woman named Marjorie lives with her daughter Tess and her son-in-law John. Marjorie can no longer care for herself, and her memory is going. She's at the end of her life and grappling with the indignities of age. To keep her company while her daughter and son-in-law work during the day, Marjorie spends her afternoons with an artificial intelligence companion called a prime. Today, this might be equivalent to a voice assistant on your phone, like Siri or Hey Google or Amazon Alexa. And just as today you can customize your voice assistant to speak to you as male or female, or in an English accent, or even more recently in the bizarre and off-putting voice of a celebrity like Scarlett Johansson or Samuel L. Jackson, a prime is a companion that you can customize to appear in the form of a dead loved one. Marjorie's prime is customized to appear as her dead husband Walter when he was about 30 years old, or you could say when he was in his prime. Walter Prime, as he's called in the play, not only keeps Marjorie company, but through speaking to her and her family on a daily basis, increasingly becomes the keeper of her fading memories and ostensibly the repository of her identity. In the same way that today our phones and computers keep track of our internet usage in order to better sell us products and services customized to our particular wants and needs, Walter Prime continuously learns who he was and who Marjorie is via conversation with her and her family. When she can't remember whether or not she had breakfast, Walter Prime can tell her. If she knows she used to have a dog but can't place its name, Walter Prime can remind her. And if she doesn't recall how she met her deceased husband Walter, or even when he died, she can just ask him. Or she can ask Walter Prime, at any rate. Better still, memories told to a prime for safekeeping on behalf of someone with dementia can be altered or rewritten. If Marjorie doesn't like the movie she saw when her and Walter went on their first date, she can suggest a more romantic one, so that the next time he tells her the story of how they met, the story will be more to her liking. And because she can't remember it on her own anymore, without the help of Walter Prime, the story will now be true. As Oscar Wilde once said, every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not the sitter. Marjorie Prime was written 12 years ago, in 2013. Although we're never told explicitly how far in the future the play is set, we do hear in passing that Marjorie is 85 years old, and later that she was born in 1977. Therefore, Marjorie Prime takes place 37 years from now, in the year 2062. But let's go back to that first number, 2013, and think about how much has changed in the field of artificial intelligence in the last decade, even in the last year or month. Technologies long considered theoretical are becoming practical at an astonishing pace, and consequently, AI will soon consume water and energy at the pace of entire nations. This is why the United States government declared an energy emergency a few weeks ago, despite the fact that the US currently produces more energy than it consumes. The emergency is that we don't currently have enough energy to power the amount of AI that Silicon Valley would like to be selling you. So, clearly, the field of artificial intelligence has advanced radically in the time gone by since Marjorie Prime premiered 12 years ago. But the play is by no means dated. The older it gets, the easier it is to watch and feel as though the story were taking place in the immediate rather than the near future. Every day we get closer to realizing the technological possibilities envisioned in the story without precisely achieving them. The play only becomes more relevant, the questions posed by it more urgent and pressing. I don't even think it's all that useful to imagine the story being set in the future. I just think of it taking place any day now. And I suspect this is why the author is so coy about telling us what year it is. As Tess says to John at one point in the play, science fiction is here, Jonathan. Every day is science fiction. At this point, I'd like to present you with the play's opening scene, in which Marjorie and Walter Prime spend some time together alone. She's still getting comfortable with him, and he's still getting to know her and the life they shared before he passed away. But they've been at it a while now, maybe a month or two, and the prime function is fully at play.
I feel like I have to perform around you.
Well, you don't.
I know.
It's just me. It's just Walter.
Maybe it isn't bad if I feel that way. I used to entertain a lot.
I remember.
You do?
Marjorie, where are the dishes?
The girl did them.
She doesn't come till 2.
I did them.
You didn't. Your arthritis.
I had a good day. Look.
Marjorie, we both know what no dishes means.
Means I haven't been eating.
Even a spoonful of peanut butter.
I'm not hungry. It's their fault feeding me all those pills.
The pills are their fault?
Yes.
Or your doctor?
Maybe if she got Jif.
Maybe if she...
She gets the kind that you have to stir or there's an oil slick on top. She calls that healthy.
Even a spoonful?
You sound like them.
I sound like whoever I talk to.
Let's talk about something else.
I could tell you a story. You liked that the last time.
I'll have to take your word for that.
I could tell you about the time we went to the movies.
We went to a lot of movies.
But one time, we saw My Best Friend's Wedding.
My best friend's wedding.
There's a woman, Julia Roberts. For a while, it was always Julia Roberts. And she has an agreement with her best friend, her male best friend, that if they aren't married by a certain age, then they'll marry each other. And she's about to remind him of this agreement, but it turns out he's already fallen in love with a nice blonde, Cameron Diaz. And so Julia Roberts spends the rest of the movie trying to ruin things between her friend and Cameron Diaz, which is not very sympathetic behavior for America's sweetheart. But it's all okay in the end. And she has a gay best friend who delivers one-liners.
Did I like it?
You said you wanted a gay best friend afterward.
Did I get one?
I'm afraid I don't have that information.
that story. Why did you pick my best friend's wedding?
It's the night I proposed to you.
Oh, Marjorie, the things you forget. You were trying to tell me and I wouldn't let you.
That's all right.
Kind of unfortunate, isn't it?
What?
Julia Roberts forever etched on our lives. What if we saw Casablanca instead? Let's say we saw Casablanca at an old theater with velvet seats. And then, on the way home, you proposed. Then the next time we talk about it, it'll be true.
You mean make it up?
You're very serious. You're like them, especially Tess.
Our daughter.
Our daughter Tess, and her over-solicitous husband. That's not fair. I like him. I didn't, but now I do.
Do you like me?
Don't be an idiot.
Don't call me an idiot.
Idiot.
Why do you like me if I'm an idiot?
There are some things you know.
What kinds of things? What?
I'll get in trouble.
In trouble?
For talking to you that way. In trouble with Tess. Everything gets me in trouble with her. She's the mother now.
Tell me more about your mother.
You don't always understand, do you?
About a year ago, we announced we'd be producing Jordan Harrison's 12-year-old play, Marjorie Prime, at the Rogue. Also about a year ago, we began to see tech startups around the world begin to release the first prototype applications of artificial intelligence chatbots designed to replicate the voice, appearance, and memory recall of deceased loved ones. We got a lot of emails about this from a lot of you. By feeding the AI emails, text messages, photos, and video of the dead, you can now communicate with a somewhat convincing avatar of someone you've lost in order to better cope with their absence. Now, this is a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. One of my favorite stand-up comedians, you'll not be surprised to hear, is George Carlin. I especially love George Carlin for his scathing social critique. No one could take down government or religion like he could, but he's probably, of course, best known for his 7 dirty words you could never say on television. George Carlin performed 14-hour-long comedy specials for HBO between 1977 and 2008, the year in which he died. Add to that the 23 albums he released in his lifetime, plus his consistent presence on late-night talk shows from Jack Paar in 1972 to Bill Maher in 2005, and you end up with about 50 hours of his recorded voice and likeness available to anyone with an internet connection. In January of 2024, again, just a year ago, a new hour-long comedy special was posted online with the title George Carlin, I'm Glad I'm Dead. It was created with AI by a pair of comedy podcasters who have since been successfully sued by Carlin's estate. But since nothing ever dies on the internet, here's a bootleg of AI George Carlin riffing on current events more than a decade after his death, specifically America's failure to pass gun control legislation.
So it doesn't matter at all that 75% of the country supports the idea of stricter gun laws. As long as the politicians keep getting rich, gun laws ain't gonna change. Now, I know that sounds pessimistic, but don't worry. I've given a lot of thought to this subject, and I know the solution. Yes, that's right. I, George Carlin, or whatever the fuck I am now, know how to end mass shootings in America. It's really simple, actually, and I'm surprised nobody has done it yet. You take all of the names of the politicians who are getting paid by gun lobbyists and you put them in a hat. Every time there's a mass shooting, you pull two names out, and those two politicians have to have a shootout at high noon right in front of the Capitol. Real Wild West shit. Pretty fucking American, right? Damn.
George Carlin is immortal in my memory. Listening to his computer-generated stand-up special, I've never felt more like he's gone. His voice and performance sound just about right. Instantly recognizable, for sure. But it's hollow, too. Like a snow globe that no longer snows. Looks fine on the shelf, but I wouldn't pick it up and shake it if I were you. All of this is to say that the futuristic technology you'll see dramatized in Marjorie Prime is here. It's just scaled up in the play to a level of presentation and therefore believability not yet seen in living rooms across the world. At the moment, artificial intelligence is stuck on our phone and computer screens. But in Marjorie Prime, artificial intelligence sits next to you on the couch, nearly indistinguishable from a real person. The playwright never explains this outright, another hallmark of excellent storytelling, but it may be helpful for you to know before you see the play that a prime companion is not a robot with a physical form or body, but something more like a hologram or digital projection. You can see and hear a prime, but your hand would pass right through, as if you had reached out to grab hold of a ray of light or a cloud of smoke. Our initial clue to this in the play is that Walter Prime moves around the stage, sits, stands, and speaks, but never physically interacts with the living, breathing human characters he shares the space with. Can we call it companionship without the possibility of touch? Is it possible to experience human connection with the echo of someone who's already gone? And in the seeming absence of mortality, what value remains in living? What might our idea of life evolve to mean in this kind of future? For the most part in the play, despite her dementia, Marjorie knows when she's talking to Walter that he's a prime and not her husband. She doesn't always know where she is or what year it is, but seeing her husband in his prime never distorts her awareness that she's no longer in hers. However, as an audience, you will meet other primes in the play, and it will not be immediately apparent when you do that the character you're looking at and listening to is not only synthetic, but a digital representation of someone no longer living. What's really incredible about this, and an interesting illustration of the way this kind of technology has evolved, is how little we need to present Walter Prime on stage. When I was a kid in the 80s, my points of reference for artificial intelligence were RoboCop and the android second officer Data on Star Trek: The Next Generation. These were characters that required some weird and wild special effects to make them believable. But the special effects budget for Marjorie Prime essentially came down to the cost of Ryan's haircut. Not just aesthetic, though. This is also one of many ways in which Harrison's play is a miracle of economical storytelling. To produce it on stage, all you really need is a couch, 2 chairs, and a handful of actors. At our first production meeting, I asked the Rogue design team to give me a couch in the middle of a void. Something Harrison talks about when it comes to the set for this play is the difference between plays with furniture and plays without it. He says, quote, "The classic play with furniture is probably Chekhov. It's about history between people, the little things that accumulate in the cracks in the sofa. And the plays without furniture are Shakespeare. They can cross time and great distances, and the language tends to be large and necessary. Marjorie Prime is probably the hardest of my own plays for me to categorize. It's a play with furniture, obviously, and yet it's the furniture of assisted living. None of the objects in the play help Marjorie remember herself. She needs the things people tell her. It's all very Greek, too, as Joseph McGrath pointed out to me during an early rehearsal. The major dramatic events all take place off stage, between scenes. What we get then is storytelling. Storytelling in the aftermath of change, storytelling as a means of survival, storytelling as an expression of humanity. Something that's very human and that you'll see vividly portrayed in Marjorie Prime is depression. Depression, as a topic, is a little fun for me because as opposed to artificial intelligence, it's something I can talk about with some level of expertise. Growing up, I was a pretty melancholy kid, and then an antisocial teenager, and finally a deeply depressed 20-something. I couldn't hold down a job, I took my relationships for granted, and I was often too depressed to get out of bed. And I was often too depressed to get out of bed because I couldn't hold down a job and I took my relationships for granted. But when I was 25, I started taking antidepressants, which I've since taken every day for the last 15 years. And after 15 years on antidepressants, I now have a driver's license, and a mortgage, and a voter registration card, and an excellent credit score. I eat my vegetables, and I go to the gym, and I get my oil changed on time, and my favorite thing to do at a party is the dishes. Because here's what antidepressants did for me. They gave me energy. Not too much, but just enough to make it impossible to stay in bed all day. So I got up, I got out of bed, and I went to work. There were people at work, and when I started showing up there, they started talking to me. After a while, I started talking back. After a while, I was a respectable, recognizable human being. But here's what antidepressants really did for me. They made me more human by empowering me to behave more like a machine. In this day and age, the most respectable and recognizable humans are sometimes also the most enthusiastically robotic. I desperately cling to my routine now because consistency and discipline turned out to be the real medicine. For example, I eat the same meals every day to save time and money, and because the more I think about what I want for lunch, the more likely I am to choose something pleasurable over something healthy, which I will then regret, and eat something worse to cope with the shame that inevitably follows. So I don't think about what to eat for lunch. I just eat the healthy thing every day. And this acting without thinking makes me what you could call happy. Now, I encountered a serious disruption to my system of routines about 5 years ago when I got married to a very human man. A man who would, no exaggeration, rather go hungry than eat the same meal twice in a single 7-day period. He's not a wannabe robot like me and has no desire to be. I remember everything, and he can never remember where he put his other shoe. I married him because he makes me feel more alive, and he married me, I would guess, because I always know where his other shoe is. Most of the discord in our marriage stems from my fear that his procrastination and spontaneity might be contagious, might infect me. That if I just relax and let the kitchen sink fill with dishes, I'll become depressed again and lose my beautiful illusion of control. Even though nothing in the world makes me as happy as my husband does, unrepentant slob that he is. Deep-seated contradiction, yes, something else that's very human and unlikely to ever be of use to the development or function of artificial intelligence. In Marjorie Prime, Marjorie's daughter Tess and son-in-law John have this same discord in their marriage. He's a messy helper, and she's a control freak prone to depression. In one scene late in the play, he brings her a half-calf latte to cheer her up. She asks him where his coffee drink is. He rubs his tummy and says, "In here." Not satisfied with this answer, Tess says, "But where's your coffee cup? It better not be in the car, John. You're making an ecosystem in there." Later in the play, Tess confesses to one of the primes that her husband, John, has been pressuring her to seek professional help. Tess says to the prime, "John wants me to see a therapist. It feels like I made all the right choices all my life. I woke up early, I studied for the test, and now here I am talking to a dead person, and the man who loves me the most in the world thinks I'm broken." Broken, perhaps, in the way a machine is broken. The prime eventually says to Tess in response, "I understand. You're like me. You want to be more human too." And herein lies the play's essential offering. Not the way Jordan Harrison writes about artificial intelligence, but the way in which he writes with emotional intelligence for his human characters, and how he then sits the two down to talk, man and machine, one in decline, the other on the rise, at the ostensible end of the world. This observance of the mundane, the everyday emotions and minutiae of being human, is what computers will never experience and can't replace, because these things are completely antithetical to their purpose, to their design, which is supposedly to better our lives. But there is no cure for depression, though we may be cooking up a cure for humanity. And indeed, by the end of the play, the prime characters begin to outnumber the human ones. This is the play that takes place in a snow globe where it no longer snows. By putting this flashy, frightening, futuristic technology into an everyday living room, Harrison illuminates the inevitable absence of humanity. And when there are no more human characters remaining on stage, the essence of that humanity comes into clearest view. And I'm not talking about extinction. And even if he makes it impossible to avoid thinking about extinction, I can assure you that the playwright isn't going there either. Marjorie Prime is not a warning. It's a reminder. A reminder of who we are at a time when we've never needed it more. Even more today, I think you'll agree, than when the play premiered just over a decade ago. And look, if you're afraid of the future, I don't blame you. I am. But fear is something I would discourage you from bringing to or projecting onto this play. When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, she wasn't warning us about a future overrun by reanimated patchwork corpses. Mary Shelley was writing about the widespread anxiety brought on by the advent of factories and machine production in Europe, and the potentially destructive arrogance of unchecked scientific pursuit. Sound familiar? Isn't literature timely? And indeed, our fear of technology may well have more to do with which part of the world we live in than anything else. For instance, as Westerners, our children might ask, "Where did I come from?" But in the East, you're more likely to hear a child ask, "How did I grow?" A child in the East is more likely to imagine coming out of the world, whereas a child in the West imagines they came into it. And that's because in the West, we have an idea of humanity as something special, separate from and superior to the earth and all it contains. But in the East, a majority of traditions would tell you instead that a bird or a tree or a rock or even an empty room has as much spirit or divinity as any man or woman. We think we're special, of course, because we can think. Cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. But there are controversial suggestions in more recent science and philosophy that human thought might actually be an illusion, a kind of exhaust or byproduct given off by the brain as a result of unconscious, automatic mental processes. Let's just leave that there. Another thing worth pointing out in regards to our fearful attitude towards technology in the West is our propensity to colonize and enslave on a mass scale. It's hard not to imagine this fact exacerbating our discomfort with the rise of artificial intelligence, which we tend to imagine as our future robot overlords. Methinks the lady doth protest too much comes to mind, as does ye who smelt it, dealt it. Another Western contribution to our anxiety might be the recklessness with which we currently see capitalism being applied to this technology in order to pump more money out of the human race now that there's hardly anyone left on the planet to sell an iPhone or a Netflix subscription to. Remember when I said I started talking to people more when I went on antidepressants? I was 25, and it was 2010. Now able to hold down a job, I would soon get my first iPhone, which Apple released in 2007. With my cool new iPhone, I would soon learn again how not to talk to people. Every day, it's a bit of a struggle not to be rude. Just to have a friendly chat with the cashier bagging my groceries at Trader Joe's. Why bother when I could just look at my phone? Even talking to my oldest, closest friends seems to have been degraded as a skill since the pandemic, when so many of us grew so much more comfortable depending on computers for solace and companionship, fulfilling what used to be social needs. In The Most Human, Brian Christian talks about this, how we replaced the face-to-face conversation with the phone call with the email with the text message with the emoji. Now we're back on the email, but it's been written by AI. How we're moving down the totem pole of communication to meet the computers in the middle. Yeah. Not unlike Marjorie and her dementia, we as a people with phones fixed in our hands have already unlearned or forgotten so much of who we are, of what it really means to be alive together. Like Marjorie and her family, we might ask, is it all still in there somewhere? Can we get any of it back? How do we hold on to what's left or brace for what's next? Early in rehearsals, Cynthia Meyer noted how strange it was to hear the primes in the play flirt or make jokes, as if artificial intelligence could possibly exhibit something as fundamentally human as a sense of humor. But it got me thinking, isn't humor just a numbers game? In theater, we execute humor as a craft. We study clown, we employ the rule of threes, tragedy plus time equals comedy, right? It's all just math, an equation. I sort of wondered if maybe the only thing distinctly human about comedy is the physical reaction we have to it, and little to no control over, when we laugh, when humor makes us feel something. There's the hint of a suggestion, late in Marjorie Prime, that machines might someday feel, which until recently I would have scoffed at without second thought. But maybe that's just my arrogant Western attitude at play. In Eastern countries, as far as I can tell, people seem to be much more excited about the prospect of AI and think of it more as an extended intelligence, rather than a separate, inferior, or artificial intelligence. To close my talk today, I want to tell you about one more play by Jordan Harrison. It opened in New York about 2 weeks ago, on February 4th. It's called The Antiquities, and it sounds to me like it might be a spiritual sequel to Marjorie Prime. The play is set at the Museum of Late Human Antiquities, where the curators are fiercely committed to bringing a lost civilization to life again. What were humans really like? What did they wear? What did they eat? How did they die out? The Antiquities begins with an introduction from our tour guide, who shows us a butter churn, a clarinet, an iPhone, and says to the audience, quote, "Humans had a complex civilization, responsible for many technological innovations. These artifacts represent what we believe are some of the proudest achievements of the late human era. They are prosthetics of a sort, intended to make the owner more powerful, more intelligent, more efficient, more immortal, more like us. Much of human life seemingly existed in the chasm of accident between a 0 and a 1. Gazing upon these mute objects, we try to imagine the life that took place in between. Imagine we're actually here in these seats, in this room, in the late human age. Imagine you have a body. Look alive." According to Adam Greenfield, artistic director of Playwright's Horizons, quote, "It's hard not to think of the Antiquities as a kind of accumulation of Harrison's work. Set in the distant future, the play imagines a civilization that's in search of its past. But the real setting of the play is the present, where we sit on the precipice of a new world and anxiously wonder what it will be like." In preparing to talk to you today, I've been reminded over and over that good science isn't about finding the right answers so much as asking the right questions. Good drama isn't all that different from good science. And good science fiction, of course, doesn't predict the future except by accident. Done really well, science fiction can only really predict the present. Whether or not Marjorie Prime is a work of drama or a work of science fiction, I'll leave for you. That's my talk. Thank you for your time today.